was thick with humidity, kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel labored. The dense jungle canopy above blocked out most of the sun, casting long shadows that danced eerily in the underbrush. It was the start of another mission, but something about this one felt different, heavier. The men of Bravo Company had been through hell and back before, but this mission had an ominous air that none of them could shake. Captain John Red Higgins, known for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts, gathered his men around a makeshift table in their tent. The men were silent, their faces etched with tension as they listened to their leader. The mission was straightforward on paper: patrol the Red River area, a stretch of dense jungle near the Laos border that had been a hotspot for enemy activity. But as Higgins unfolded the map, he couldn't help but notice how the lines and contours seemed to blur together, as if the jungle itself was alive, trying to swallow the details. "The brass says it's a simple recon," Higgins started, his voice steady but with an edge that betrayed his unease. "But we all know there's nothing simple about this place. Stay sharp, stay together, and we'll get through this." Sergeant Frank Miller, the company's point man, exchanged a glance with Corporal Danny Specs Thompson, the radio operator. They both knew that every mission was a gamble, but the stakes felt higher this time. The Red River was known not just for its strategic importance, but also for the stories. Ghost stories, they called them, whispered among the men during long night stays of soldiers vanishing, without a trace, strange lights flickering in the trees, and the eerie cries that sometimes echoed through the jungle at night. The journey began early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as Bravo Company set out. The jungle was thick and unforgiving, the ground uneven and treacherous. The men moved in near silence. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional squawk of a bird. As the day wore on, the heat became oppressive, and the air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying vegetation. By dusk, they had reached a small clearing by the river, a perfect spot to set up camp. The men were exhausted, but there was no time to relax. As they set up their perimeter, Miller couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't the first time he'd felt uneasy in the jungle, but this was different. The trees seemed to close in around them, the darkness deeper and more suffocating than usual. At night, as the men took turns on watch, the jungle came alive with unfamiliar sounds. It wasn't the usual chorus of insects and animals. There was something else. Something that sent chills down the spine of even the most hardened soldiers. Faint whispers seemed to float on the breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig would make every man reach for his weapon. Then, just before midnight, came the first sign. A faint glow appeared in the distance, flickering through the trees like a distant fire. Miller, who was on watch at the time, nudged Thompson awake. "You see that?" he whispered, pointing towards the light. Thompson nodded, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell is that?" "Don't know. Doesn't look like any fire I've seen. Better wake the captain." Higgins, groggy but alert, crawled out of his tent and stared into the darkness. The light was still there, hovering in the distance, flickering in and out like a dying ember. "Stay low," he ordered. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The men huddled together, weapons at the ready, as they watched the light. But as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving nothing but darkness and the oppressive silence of the jungle. "False alarm, maybe," Thompson suggested, though his voice was shaky. "Maybe," Higgins replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "But let's double the watch tonight. Something doesn't feel right." The following day, the men continued their patrol, but the strange events of the previous night weighed heavily on their minds. The jungle was no longer just an enemy to be navigated. It felt like a living entity. Hostile and aware of their presence, the sun barely pierced the thick canopy, casting everything in an eerie twilight that made it hard to distinguish friend from foe. As they marched deeper into the jungle, the whispers began again. Faint and just beyond comprehension, the men kept their eyes forward, trying to focus on the mission, but the unseen presence in the jungle gnawed at their nerves. By the afternoon, the tension reached a breaking point. Private Jimmy Jinx Robinson, the youngest member of the team, suddenly froze in his tracks, his eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Hear what, Jinx?" Miller asked, scanning the jungle around them. It was a voice. Jinx replied, his face pale. "Right in my ear. It said my name." "The Men exchanged uneasy glances, but Higgins quickly took charge. Stay focused, soldier. We're almost at the next checkpoint. But as the day wore on, it became clear that something was very wrong. The jungle was too quiet, the oppressive silence only broken by the occasional snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves. Then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet gave way. Miller was the first to fall, sliding down a hidden slope into a dark ravine. The others scrambled to grab him, but the jungle seemed determined to swallow them whole. They slid and tumbled down the slope, crashing through the underbrush until they finally came to a stop at the bottom. Bruised and shaken, the men slowly got to their feet, only to find themselves in a place that wasn't on any map. The ravine was deep, the walls covered in thick, gnarled roots that twisted like the fingers of some ancient, malevolent creature. The air was colder here, and the oppressive feeling of being watched was even stronger. "What the hell is this place?" Thompson muttered, looking around. "Hell if I know." Higgins replied, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. "But we're not alone here. Stay sharp." As they tried to find a way out, they stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold. Half buried in the mud was a skeleton, still clad in the tattered remnants of a U.S. Army uniform. The dog tags were missing, the name and identity of the unfortunate soul lost to time. But there was something else, something far more disturbing. Carved into the bones were strange symbols that none of them could recognize. The sight sent a wave of fear through the group, and even Higgins, the unshakable leader, felt a chill run down his spine. "We need to get out of here," Miller said, his voice trembling. "This place, it's wrong." But the jungle had other plans. As they tried to retrace their steps, they found that the path they had come from was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The walls of the ravine seemed to close in around them, the roots twisting and writhing as if alive. And then the whispers began again, louder this time, closer. The men raised their weapons, but there was nothing to shoot at, nothing to fight. The jungle itself seemed to be alive, taunting them, toying with their minds. Higgins knew they were in a bad situation, but he refused to give in to fear. "We stick together," he said, his voice firm. "We find a way out of here and get back to base. No one gets left behind." But as they moved deeper into the ravine, it became clear that getting out was not going to be easy. The jungle was no longer just a backdrop to their mission. It had become the enemy, a living, breathing entity determined to keep them there forever. The oppressive heat of the jungle had given way to an unsettling chill. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the light was fading fast, and the dense canopy above them seemed to swallow what little remained. Bravo Company was trapped in the ravine, a place that felt more like a tomb with each passing moment. Captain John Red Higgins led the group, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out. The eerie carvings on the skeleton they had found earlier still haunted him. He'd seen death in many forms during the war. But this was something else. The jungle felt alive, aware of their presence, and it was closing in on them. Sergeant Frank Miller was right behind him, his usual stoic expression replaced by a furrowed brow. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched not by the Viet Cong, but by something older, something malevolent. The whispers had stopped for now, but the silence was just as unnerving. It was as if the jungle was waiting for something. Captain Miller said, his voice low but tense, "We need to get out of here. This place, it's not right." Higgins nodded, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth was, he didn't know how to get them out. The jungle had shifted. The path they had come from was gone, and the thick roots and underbrush were like a maze with no exit. Corporal Danny Specs Thompson, the radio operator, was fidgeting with the comms, trying to get a signal, but all he got was static. The harsh crackle, a cruel reminder of how isolated they were. "No signal, sir. We're cut off." Private Jimmy Jinx Robinson was struggling to keep it together. The young soldier had always been superstitious, but this was beyond anything he'd ever feared. His hands were shaking, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. "Jinx, pull it together," Miller snapped, more to calm himself than the private. "You heard the captain. We stick together." But Jinx wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the voice he had heard earlier, his name whispered in his ear like a death sentence. He knew he hadn't imagined it. The jungle had spoken to him, and it was hungry. The darkness was absolute, the jungle thick with shadows that moved and twisted as if alive. Temperature had dropped, and a dense fog was beginning to creep in, curling around their legs like the tendrils of some unseen beast. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and every breath felt heavy, laden with the weight of unseen eyes. Higgins ordered the men to make camp, though he knew rest was unlikely. They set up a small perimeter, their rifles at the ready, eyes darting to every rustle and shadow. The jungle had grown silent again, but the silence was worse than the whispers. It was a silence that pressed in on them, filled with the anticipation of something terrible. As they sat around a small, flickering fire, the men tried to keep their minds occupied. Thompson pulled out a deck of cards, but his hands were shaking too much to shuffle them properly. Miller sat with his back to a tree, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Jinx, still on edge, kept glancing at the shadows. His fingers twitching on the trigger of his rifle, Higgins knew he had to keep morale up, but he was running out of ideas. The jungle was breaking them down, playing on their fears, and the unknown was more terrifying than any enemy they had faced before. "Anyone got a story?" Higgins asked, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation. "Something to pass the time." Miller looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You want a story, Captain? How about the one they tell about this place?" The men looked at him. Curiosity piqued despite their fear. "They say this jungle is cursed," Miller continued, his voice low and gravelly. "Long before the war, long before the French, the locals avoided this place. They said it was the home of spirits, dark spirits that fed on the living during the Indochina War. Whole platoons went missing in these parts, no bodies, no traces, just gone. The locals say the jungle took them." "Jesus, Sarge, that's just a story," Thompson muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe." Miller replied, "But I've seen some things out here that make me wonder." As if on cue, a distant sound echoed through the trees, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all directions at once. The men froze, their blood running cold. "What the hell was that?" Jinx whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "Stay calm," Higgins ordered, though he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "It's just the wind." But they all knew it wasn't. The wail grew louder, closer, and was soon joined by others. A chorus of ghostly cries that filled the night air. The fog thickened, and the fire sputtered as if struggling to stay alive. Higgins felt the weight of the jungle closing in on them, the air thick with the smell of rot and the sensation of being watched. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew there was nowhere to go. They were trapped, surrounded by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. Too fast to be human, he turned, rifle at the ready, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the oppressive weight of the jungle. The men were on edge, their nerves frayed, and Higgins knew it wouldn't take much for them to snap. He had to get them out of there, but how? The jungle was a labyrinth, and every path seemed to lead them deeper into its clutches. "We need to move," Higgins said finally, his voice firm. "We can't stay here, but where do we go?" Captain Thompson asked, his voice trembling. "We don't even know where we are." "Anywhere but here," Higgins replied. "We keep moving until we find a way out." The men gathered their gear, the fire now just a smoldering pile of embers. The jungle seemed to sense their fear, the wails growing louder as they began their march into the unknown. The fog was thicker now, obscuring everything beyond a few feet, and the whispers had returned, circling them, taunting them. As they pushed forward, the ground became more treacherous, the roots and vines seeming to reach out, trying to trip them, to drag them down. The air was colder, the scent of decay stronger, and the sense of being watched was unbearable. Higgins led the way, his heart pounding in his chest, every muscle tense. He could feel the jungle closing in on them, a predator toying with its prey. The darkness was alive with unseen eyes, and the whispers were no longer just in the distance, they were right next to him, in his ear, in his mind. The men moved in silence, their eyes wide with fear, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent them into a frenzy, rifles swinging in all directions, but there was never anything there, just shadows and whispers. Then, without warning, Jinx screamed a blood-curdling cry of pure terror. The men spun around to see him thrashing in the fog, his rifle clattering to the ground. He was clawing at his face, his eyes wide with horror. They're here, he screamed, his voice breaking. Higgins rushed to him, grabbing him by the shoulders. Jinx, get a hold of yourself. But Jinx was beyond reason, his mind shattered. He kept screaming, kept clawing, until finally, he collapsed to the ground, his body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. The men stood in stunned silence, the jungle's whispers growing louder, more insistent. Higgins felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. They were losing it, all of them, and the jungle knew it. We need to keep moving, Higgins said, his voice hollow, but as he looked at his men, he knew they were on the edge, teetering between sanity and madness, and the jungle was waiting, ready to claim them. The night had fully descended, wrapping the jungle in a cloak of darkness so deep it felt as though the men were walking through ink. The whispers had grown fainter, but the sense of dread had only intensified. Bravo Company moved in a tight formation, their footsteps eerily silent on the soft, damp earth. Every man was on high alert, their senses tuned to the slightest sound or movement, as if the jungle itself could spring to life at any moment. Captain Higgins took the lead, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of a way out. But the jungle had become a maze, each direction as impenetrable as the next. The fog had thickened into a dense, suffocating blanket, and the wails that had haunted them earlier seemed to be carried on the wind, echoing from some unseen source. Sergeant Miller kept close to Jinx, who had fallen into a catatonic state after his outburst. The young private's face was pale, his eyes wide and unseeing. Muttering incoherently under his breath, Miller knew that Jinx was broken, his mind shattered by whatever horrors lurked in the jungle. The rest of the men were on edge, the tension palpable as they continued their march into the unknown. This place, it's not natural, Thompson whispered, clutching his rifle as if it were a lifeline. It feels like the jungle's alive, watching us. Shut up, Specs, Miller hissed, though the fear in his own voice betrayed him. Just keep moving. But the men could feel it, to the oppressive weight of the jungle pressing in on them, the shadows that seemed to move just out of sight, the whispers that lingered at the edge of their hearing. It was as if the jungle was toying with them, driving them deeper into madness with each passing minute. Captain, we need to stop, Corporal Davis said, his voice trembling. We're all exhausted, and Jinx, he's not going to make it much further. Higgins knew he was right, but stopping felt like giving in, like surrendering to whatever malevolent force was at play. Yet he couldn't deny the exhaustion that weighed on him, on all of them. The jungle had drained them physically and mentally, and they were running on fumes. All right, Higgins finally conceded, his voice heavy with reluctance. We'll rest here, but stay alert. This place, it's not safe. The men collapsed where they stood, too tired to even set up a proper camp. They huddled together, their backs to one another, rifles at the ready. The fog swirled around them, obscuring everything beyond a few feet, and the jungle remained deathly silent, as if holding its breath. As they settled in, Miller glanced over at Jinx, who was still muttering to himself, his eyes wide with terror. The sergeant knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jinx, Miller said softly, trying to reach the man behind the fear. It's going to be all right. We'll get out of here. You'll see. But Jinx didn't respond, his gaze fixed on some unseen horror in the darkness. Miller sighed, knowing that the young private was lost to them, whatever had gotten into his head. It wasn't going to let go. Higgins sat apart from the group, staring into the void beyond the fog. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened, how they had gone from a routine patrol to this nightmare. The jungle had changed, twisted into something unnatural, and it had them in its grip. He could feel it, the malevolent presence that stalked them, waiting for them to break. We shouldn't have come here, Higgins muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. This place, it's cursed. Suddenly, a sharp snap echoed through the fog, and every man jerked to attention. Rifles aimed at the sound. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, it seemed as if the jungle was mocking them. Did you hear that? Thompson whispered, his voice shaking. Quiet, Higgins ordered, his eyes scanning the darkness. Stay together. Don't let it separate us. But the jungle had other plans. As they strained to listen, the fog seemed to shift, curling around them like a living thing. The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all directions. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The men staggered, trying to keep their balance as the earth shook. Trees swayed violently, their branches creaking and groaning as if they were alive. The fog thickened, becoming almost tangible, pressing in on them, suffocating them. Fall back, Higgins shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the jungle. In the chaos, they lost sight of each other. The fog consumed them, separating them into the darkness. Higgins could hear the panicked shouts of his men, but they were distant, as if coming from miles away. He spun around, trying to find his bearings, but there was nothing, no light, no sound. Just the oppressive darkness. Sergeant, Thompson, anyone, Higgins called out, but there was no response. He was alone, cut off from his men, the fog swirling around him like a living thing. Panic gripped him, but he forced it down, trying to stay calm, trying to think. But the jungle was relentless, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with a torrent of voices. Leave this place. The words echoed in his head, a command he couldn't ignore. But how? How could he leave when he was lost in this endless maze? The ground trembled again, and Higgins stumbled, falling to his knees. Whispers intensified, and he felt a cold dread settle over him. And then he saw, just at the edge of his vision, a shadow moving through the fog. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch forever. It moved silently, gliding through the fog, and Higgins felt a wave of terror unlike anything he'd ever known. He tried to move, to get to his feet, but his body wouldn't respond. He was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of the creature. It was coming closer, its eyes glowing in the darkness, burning into him. Higgins could feel its gaze, cold and unforgiving, and he knew in that moment that this was the end. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The fog began to lift, and the whispers faded, leaving only the sound of Higgins' ragged breathing. He was alone in the jungle, but the terror hadn't left him. The creature was still out there, watching, waiting. He staggered to his feet, his mind racing. He had to find his men, had to get them out of here before it was too late. But as he looked around, he realized he had no idea where he was or where they had gone. And then, in the distance, he heard a familiar voice, calling his name. Captain Higgins. It was faint, but it was there, and it filled him with a renewed sense of hope. He started towards the sound, moving as quickly as he could through the dense underbrush. The jungle was still, the fog dissipating, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He pushed on, the voice growing louder, more distinct. It was Sergeant Miller, he was sure of it. Higgins felt a surge of relief. He wasn't alone, not yet. Sergeant, hold on, I'm coming, Higgins shouted, his voice breaking the eerie silence. But as he got closer, the voice began to change. It grew distorted, warped, and Higgins slowed, a sense of dread creeping over him. The voice wasn't right, it was too deep, too resonant. It seemed to echo unnaturally through the trees. Captain, come closer. Higgins stopped, his heart pounding. This wasn't Miller. Whatever was calling him, it wasn't human. Captain. The voice was closer now, almost on top of him, and Higgins felt a cold chill run down his spine. He turned slowly, his rifle at the ready, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, standing in the clearing, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long, too thin. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but Higgins could see the eyes glowing red, burning with an unnatural light. Leave this place. The voice came from the figure, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the air. Higgins felt his knees go weak, his grip on the rifle slipping. And then the figure began to move, slowly at first, then faster, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Higgins fired his rifle, the shots echoing through the jungle, but the bullets passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. It was on him in an instant, its cold, claw-like hands wrapping around his throat. Higgins gasped, struggling to breathe, his vision darkening. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was the figure's eyes burning into his soul, searing him with a terror that he knew would never leave him. And then there was nothing. Captain Higgins awoke with a jolt, the cold sweat clinging to his skin like a second layer. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes adjusted to the dim light of dawn, filtering through the thick canopy above. He was lying on the jungle floor, his body aching from the rough, uneven ground. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or what had happened, But then the memories came flooding back: the jungle, the fog, the shadowy figure, and the terror that had gripped him in its icy claws. He sat up slowly, every muscle protesting in pain, and looked around. The jungle was still, eerily quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath. There was no sign of his men, no sound of their voices, just the oppressive silence that seemed to close in on him from all sides. "Sergeant Miller, Thompson, anyone," Higgins called out, his voice hoarse. But there was no response, only the rustling of leaves in the faint breeze. Fog had lifted with the dawn, revealing a landscape that was both familiar and alien. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the underbrush was thick and tangled, making every step a struggle. Higgins pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky but holding. He had to find his men, had to regroup and figure out a way to get out of this cursed place. The memories of the night before were still fresh in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted, stalked by something far more dangerous than any enemy they had ever faced. He started walking, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves was a potential threat, and he could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, watching, waiting. As he made his way through the dense jungle, the memories of the previous night began to blur, becoming less distinct, like a nightmare fading with the light of day. But the fear remained, a constant presence just below the surface, keeping him on edge, ready to react at the slightest hint of danger. For what felt like hours, Higgins stumbled upon a small clearing. The ground was littered with broken branches and trampled undergrowth, evidence that someone or something had passed through here recently. He knelt down, examining the tracks, and felt a glimmer of hope. These were military boots, the same as his own. His men had come this way. He followed the trail, moving as quickly as he could while still remaining cautious. The jungle was a labyrinth, each turn leading deeper into its depths, but Higgins kept his focus, determined to find his men and get them out of this hellish place. As he pushed through the thick foliage, he began to hear something, a faint rhythmic thudding sound, like the beating of a drum. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It seemed to be coming from ahead. Higgins' heart raced as he pressed on, the sound growing louder with each step. It was an unnatural rhythm, out of sync with the usual noises of the jungle, and it sent a chill down his spine. He knew he should be cautious, but something compelled him to keep going, to find the source of the sound. Finally, he emerged into another clearing, this one larger and more open. In the center stood a massive, ancient tree, its gnarled roots twisting and coiling around the ground like the tendrils of some monstrous beast. And there, at the base of the tree, were his men. Sergeant Miller was the first to spot him, his face lighting up with relief as he called out, "Captain, over here!" Higgins rushed over, his heart swelling with relief as he saw that most of his men were there, huddled together around the tree. But his relief was short-lived. Something was wrong. The men were pale, their eyes wide with fear, and they kept glancing nervously at the tree as if expecting it to come to life at any moment. "Captain, you have to see this," Miller said, his voice trembling. Higgins followed his gaze to the base of the tree, and his blood ran cold. There, etched into the bark, were symbols, ancient, primitive markings that radiated a dark, malevolent energy. The symbols seemed to pulse as if alive, and Higgins could feel a wave of nausea wash over him as he stared at them. "What the hell is this?" Higgins muttered, unable to tear his eyes away from the markings. "We don't know, sir," Thompson replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But it's not natural. We tried to leave, but it's like something's keeping us here." Higgins looked around, noticing for the first time the thick vines that had grown around the clearing, forming a barrier that seemed impossible to breach. The jungle had trapped them, ensnaring them in its twisted embrace, and Higgins could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thick with a sense of impending doom. "We need to get out of here," Higgins said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "We can't stay in this place." But as they prepared to leave, the drumming sound grew louder, more insistent, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. The air was filled with the scent of decay, and Higgins felt a deep, primal fear take hold of him. The jungle was alive, and it was hungry. "Move now," Higgins shouted, but it was too late. The ground erupted, roots and vines shooting up from the earth, wrapping around the men, pulling them down into the darkness. Higgins struggled, his rifle slipping from his grasp as he fought against the living jungle. He could hear the screams of his men, their voices drowned out by the deafening roar of the earth itself. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the ground stilled. The jungle was silent once more, and Higgins found himself alone, lying on the cold, damp earth, the ancient tree looming above him. He tried to move, but his body refused to respond. The air was thick with the stench of death, and Higgins could feel the life draining from him. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the tree, its twisted branches reaching out like the arms of some ancient god, claiming him as its own. Captain Higgins awoke to the sensation of cold earth pressing against his cheek. His vision was blurry. It took a few moments for him to realize that he was lying face down in the dirt. As he struggled to his feet, every bone in his body ached, as if the jungle itself had crushed him under its weight. The memories of the previous hours were fragmented like shattered glass, each piece cutting into his consciousness. The clearing where the ancient tree stood was eerily quiet, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant calls of unseen creatures. The sky above was obscured by a thick canopy, allowing only faint shafts of light to penetrate the darkness below. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the damp smell of rotting vegetation and something rancid, like decaying flesh. As Higgins steadied himself against the trunk of the tree, he noticed the absence of his men. The clearing was empty save for him and the ancient tree that loomed over him like a sentinel. Panic began to rise in his chest as he called out, "Miller, Thompson, anyone?" But there was no reply, only the hollow echo of his own voice. Higgins felt a cold dread settle over him as he realized that he was alone. His men were gone, swallowed by the jungle, and he was left to face the terror that lurked in the shadows. He tried to piece together the events that had led him here, but the memories were slippery, elusive, like trying to grasp smoke with his bare hands. The only clear image was that of the ancient tree and the sinister markings etched into its bark. The symbols seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and Higgins could still feel the nauseating pull of their dark power. Taking a deep breath, Higgins forced himself to move. He couldn't stay here. He had to find his men, or at the very least, find a way out of this accursed place. The jungle was a labyrinth, but Higgins had been trained to navigate even the most treacherous terrain. He just needed to keep his wits about him. He took a few steps away from the tree, careful to avoid the twisted roots that snaked across the ground like coiled serpents. As he did, the jungle seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer, darker, as if the forest itself were watching him, waiting for him to make a wrong move. The drumming sound from earlier was gone, replaced by a low, constant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air. It was disorienting, and Higgins found himself glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, convinced that something was following him, lurking just out of sight. As he made his way deeper into the jungle, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the underbrush rustled. With unseen movement, Higgins could hear the whispers again, faint and indistinct, like the voices of the dead carried on the wind. He paused, trying to make sense of the sounds, but they were too faint, too fragmented. It was as if the jungle itself was speaking to him, in a language he couldn't understand, a language of the dead, those who had perished in this cursed place and whose spirits now roamed the shadows. The air grew colder as Higgins pressed on, his breath visible in the frigid air. The temperature drop was unnatural, and he could feel the chill seeping into his bones, making his movements slow and clumsy. Whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Higgins began to feel a rising sense of dread. Suddenly, he heard a rustling in the bushes ahead. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he raised his rifle, ready to fire. The sound grew louder, closer, and Higgins could see the underbrush parting as something moved through it. He took a step back, his finger on the trigger, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and then, from the darkness, a figure emerged, a man staggering towards him, his uniform tattered and covered in mud. Higgins recognized him instantly. It was Private Dawson, one of his missing men. Relief washed over him, and he lowered his rifle. "Dawson, thank God. I thought you were," Higgins began, but his words caught in his throat as Dawson drew closer. There was something wrong with him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he were being pulled along by invisible strings. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. And then Higgins saw the blood-thick, dark blood that oozed from a deep gash that crossed Dawson's throat, staining his uniform and dripping onto the ground. Higgins stepped back in horror, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing. Dawson should have been dead. No one could survive a wound like that, but here he was, standing before him, moving closer, his eyes locked on Higgins with a vacant, soulless stare. "Dawson," Higgins whispered, his voice trembling, but Dawson didn't respond. Instead, he opened his mouth and a low, guttural moan escaped his lips, a sound that was not entirely human. Higgins could see the raw, torn flesh of Dawson's throat as he tried to speak, but the words were garbled, choked by the blood that filled his mouth. Panic surged through Higgins, and he stumbled backward, his mind racing. This wasn't possible, it couldn't be real. But the sight of Dawson's mangled body, the sound of his labored breathing, and the smell of death that clung to him told Higgins otherwise. Without thinking, Higgins raised his rifle and fired. The shot rang out in the stillness of the jungle, echoing through the trees. Dawson's body jerked as the bullet struck him, but he didn't fall. Instead, he continued to stagger forward, his dead eyes locked on Higgins. Higgins fired again and again, each shot hitting its mark. But it was as if Dawson was immune to the bullets, his body convulsed with each impact. But he kept coming, his movements growing more erratic, more frenzied, as if driven by some unseen force. "Stay back, stay the hell back," Higgins screamed, but it was no use. Dawson lunged at him, his arms outstretched, his fingers clawing at the air. Higgins felt a cold, clammy hand close around his wrist, and he yanked it away, the strength of the grip far beyond what should have been possible for a dead man. In a blind panic, Higgins turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the branches and vines tearing at his clothes and skin. He could hear Dawson behind him, the sound of his footsteps growing louder, closer as he pursued him through the jungle. The whispers in the air grew louder, more frantic, as if the spirits of the jungle were urging him on, pushing him to run faster, to escape the clutches of the dead that had risen to claim him. Higgins' breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning, but he didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, the jungle swallowing him whole. And he knew that if he stopped, if he let the fear consume him, he would be lost, just another soul claimed by the haunted wilderness. But then, just as suddenly as the chase had begun, the sounds behind him ceased. Higgins slowed to a stop, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The jungle was still once more, the whispers fading into the background, the cold air lifting slightly. He turned slowly, half expecting to see Dawson still following him. But there was nothing, only the dense foliage and the shadows that lurked within it. The terror that had gripped him began to ebb, replaced by a deep, gnawing unease. What the hell was happening here? Higgins wondered, his mind reeling. Was this some kind of nightmare, a hallucination brought on by the horrors of the war? Was it something far more sinister, something beyond the realm of the living? As he stood there, trying to make sense of the madness, a faint sound reached his ears, a distant, rhythmic drumming like the beating of a heart. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, pulsing through the air like a dark omen. Higgins knew he couldn't stay here. He had to find his men, or at the very least, find a way out of this cursed jungle before it claimed him too. The whispers in the air were a constant reminder that the jungle was alive, that it was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. With a deep breath, Higgins steeled himself and continued his journey, each step taking him deeper into the heart of darkness, where the line between the living and the dead was blurred, where the shadows held secrets that no man should ever uncover. The jungle was suffocating. The dense green canopy overhead blocked out the sun, casting long shadows across the jungle floor. Captain Higgins, exhausted and on the brink of collapse, stumbled forward, his vision blurred, his mind barely holding on to sanity. The whispers, once faint and distant, now filled his head, an incessant chorus of unintelligible voices that clawed at his mind. He had been walking for hours, or maybe days, it was impossible to tell. Time had lost all meaning in this accursed place. His once pristine uniform was now in tatters, soaked with sweat, blood, and mud. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he knew that if he stopped even for a moment, the jungle would claim him. The rhythmic drumming that had haunted him since he first entered the jungle had grown louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a background noise, but a pulse that echoed through his very bones. It seemed to come from all around him, yet no matter which direction he turned, he could never pinpoint its source. As he pressed on, the jungle seemed to shift and change around him. The trees appeared to close in, their twisted trunks forming unnatural shapes, and the underbrush rustled with the movement of unseen creatures. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath his feet was soft, almost as if it were alive. Higgins' mind was a maelstrom of fear, confusion, and despair. The horrors he had witnessed, Dawson's mangled corpse, the spectral figures that stalked him had shattered his grip on reality. He could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a product of his tormented mind. But through it all, one thought remained clear. He had to find his men. They were out there somewhere, lost in the jungle just like him, and it was his duty as their captain to bring them back. He clung to this thought, using it as a lifeline to pull himself through the madness. As the day wore on, the jungle grew darker, the shadows deepening into an impenetrable blackness. The whispers became more aggressive, more coherent, as if they were speaking directly to him, calling his name, urging him to give into the darkness. Higgins tried to shut them out, to focus on the mission, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Finally, he emerged into a small clearing, and what he saw froze him in his tracks. Before him stood a massive stone structure, ancient and covered in vines and moss. It was a temple, or what remained of one, its walls crumbling and its entrance partially collapsed. The drumming was loud as ear, reverberating through the air like a heartbeat. Higgins could feel it in his chest, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to match the rhythm of his own heart. The temple exuded an aura of malevolence, as if it were a living entity watching him, waiting for him to make a move. The entrance was dark, a gaping maw that seemed to swallow the light, and from within came a low rumbling sound like the growl of a great beast. Higgins knew he had no choice. Whatever answers he sought, whatever fate awaited him, lay within that temple. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he approached the entrance. The air grew colder as he crossed the threshold, the darkness closing in around him like a shroud. The walls of the temple were covered in the same strange markings he had seen on the ancient tree. As he ran his fingers over them, he felt a pulse of energy, like an electric shock that sent a jolt up his arm. The interior of the temple was vast, the ceiling disappearing into the darkness above. The walls were lined with ancient statues, their faces twisted into expressions of agony and despair. At the far end of the chamber stood an altar upon which lay the bodies of his men Miller, Thompson, Dawson, and the others. They were laid out in a circle, their lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling, their bodies twisted and broken. Higgins fell to his knees, a cry of anguish escaping his lips. His men were dead, their bodies desecrated, sacrificed to some ancient, unknowable force. He had failed them, and now they were lost to him forever. As he knelt there, consumed by grief and guilt, the drumming grew louder, more frantic. The air around him seemed to vibrate, and the shadows on the walls began to move, shifting and coalescing into dark, humanoid shapes. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Higgins could feel his sanity slipping away. He looked up at the altar, and his blood ran cold. The shadows were converging on the bodies of his men, their dark, featureless forms bending over them, their hands reaching out to touch the lifeless flesh. As they did, the bodies began to twitch and convulse, as if being reanimated by some unholy force. Higgins watched in horror as his men began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes glowing with a sickly, pale light. They turned to face him, their mouths opening in unison to release a low, guttural moan that echoed through the chamber. "Captain, help us." The voice was not their own. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent, speaking through them, mocking him, taunting him with his failure. Higgins stumbled back, his mind reeling, his body trembling with fear. The reanimated soldiers began to move towards him, their steps slow and deliberate, their eyes locked on him with an intensity that burned into his soul. Higgins wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but his legs refused to move. He was frozen, trapped in a waking nightmare with no escape. As they closed in on him, the drumming reached a fever pitch and the temple walls began to shake, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The shadows grew darker, thicker. wrapping around Higgins like tendrils, pulling him towards the altar. He struggled, fought against the unseen force that held him, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, too powerful. They lifted him off the ground, dragging him towards the altar where his men waited, their eyes glowing with that unnatural light. The last thing Higgins saw before the darkness consumed him was the twisted, grinning face of the ancient statue that stood behind the altar. Its eyes glowed with the same pale light as his men's. His mouth opened to release a deafening, inhuman roar that shook the very foundations of the temple. And then there was nothing, only darkness and the sound of the drumming, fading into the distance as Captain Higgins was swallowed by the shadows, lost forever to the jungle and the ancient evil that dwelled within. Weeks later, a search party was sent to find Captain Higgins and his men. They scoured the jungle for days, but found no trace of the soldiers or the ancient temple that had claimed them. The jungle was vast, impenetrable, and it seemed to swallow all who dared to enter. The mission was officially listed as a failure, the men presumed dead, their bodies never recovered. But those who had heard the whispers, who had ventured into the heart of the jungle, knew the truth. The jungle was alive, haunted by the spirits of the dead, and it would continue to claim the souls of those who dared to disturb its ancient, malevolent secrets. And somewhere, deep within the jungle, the drumming continued, a constant reminder that the past never truly dies, and that some evils are eternal,